It was while Samson was in the market of Timnath, buying ointments to apply to his massive, battle-wearied muscles, that he met up with Delilah. She was on a road trip and was buying bread. "Samson of the long hair," she said, sneaking up beside him. "How goes it?" He felt his great skull-sized knees start to buckle. It was as though something inside him that he thought was dead had crawled out to face him. An angel. He stood before her, stammering, until Delilah smiled and told him she had a splinter, and would he be so kind as to carry her to the inn. Samson's hands floated out from his sides. He placed his thumbs under Delilah's armpits, which were warm and soft. He lifted her slowly off the ground until she was eye level with him. He walked forward like a sleepwalker. He stared into her eyes without blinking. She giggled and told him not to be silly, and he placed her on his shoulders. She spread her legs wide around the back of his tree-trunk neck. She rode him in silence. After a while, she ran her hand through his knotted hair, and as she did so, she gritted her teeth, swallowing down the vomit rising in her throat. She knows all that I think, Samson thought. Even now. And even now. The first time they made love, Delilah thought that Samson smelled like live chickens and saliva. The tips of his greasy hair poked her face. When he was done, Samson laid beside her, his hands behind his head, exposing his armpits. "What is the secret of your strength?" asked Delilah. She said it quickly, impatient. She wanted revenge for Jason's death. She wanted revenge for her people. All of this before passing out from Samson's stink. Samson considered telling her the story of his mother and the angel, but he did not want to get all serious so fast. He was aware of how intense he could be, and he decided to keep it in check. He knew that once he got started, he would never be able to shut up, pouring out his heart about everything. How he hates his father, how he can't stop thinking about Jason, how he's loved her for so long that he feels at this moment like he could simply die of happiness. Just thinking about all of those things, how true they were, made him feel like he was going to cry. So instead, he went for playful. "I do not know the source of my strength, but I do know that if I were ever made the marshal in a parade, that would be the end of it." "Who told you this?" asked Delilah. An old weird-looking woman," said Samson. "She had a limp." That evening, Delilah met with her cohorts at the tavern and told them all about what she had learned. Quickly, the Philistines arranged for a parade to honor their mighty enemy. There was to be a marching band, and even a banner that would read, "May the gods anoint Samson." There were to be lyre players, snake charmers, mimics, and women gyrating their hips. Once assembled, they marched to Samson's front door, whereupon Samson moved swiftly among their ranks, from musician to juggler to belly dancer, slaughtering indiscriminately using only his feet, fists, and the jawbone from the ass he was in the midst of munching. He bit their fingers and roundhouse kicked their chins. "Let the smiting rain down like morning dew," cried Samson, twirling two old men around by their beards. Delilah turned away from the slaughter and looked up to the heavens. It was a clear, cloudless day. She was wondering if her family had made it away safely, when she saw Samson stop dead in his tracks in front of her. "What are you doing here?" he asked. The next morning, Samson showed up at their love nest, a bullock draped over his shoulder like a shawl. "You know," said Delilah, "during your attack you broke my grandfather's hip." "I never forget one I have punished with my fist," said Samson. "Does your grandfather scream like a girl? There was an old-timer who had screams that tickled my ears." Killing people was making Samson number by the second. He liked it that way. He wanted to get so numb that he would no longer be able to hear the voices of the people he had killed that haunted him nightly, or the chastising voice of his father who had disavowed and disowned him. Even when he thought back to the last time he saw his father, out in the market, and how the old man had slapped him across the lips in front of everyone, he could not get worked up. The only thing that Samson got worked up about was Delilah. When she touched his face, he felt like a sparrow's wing had gotten under his flesh. As the weeks wore on, Delilah continued to bug Samson for his secret. After he told her that carrots were his weakness, the next morning he awoke to find carrots sticking out of every orifice on his body. When he told her that it was the Earth's sun that fueled him, he awoke the next morning to find himself in a pitch-black catacomb. He had to scrape his way out with his fingernails and toenails. It was after 11 of these unfortunate events that Samson finally allowed himself to see what was happening. It was his sick love of Delilah that had been keeping him so deluded. Delilah had to be involved in the attempts on his life. All the coincidences that had been happening lately were just too odd to dismiss. And yet, he simply could not allow himself to think that one he loved so much could possibly be acting as an agent of his destruction. He pushed the thought from his head and continued to keep deferring, offering Delilah jokes and lies instead of the truth. But in the end, he was forced to confront her. "Delilah, if I tell you the secret of my strength, I fear you will use it against me. I am not the smartest of men, but I do know that something is amiss." "Pranks of the gods," she said. "Everyone, even the spirits, try to tear us apart." "It's just so weird," said Samson. "Would you do anything for me, Samson?" "I would walk through walls of fire for you," he said. "Then tell me what it is that makes you so strong." Samson undid his ponytail and leaned back in bed. His hair fanned out across the pillow like the tail of a peacock. Because of the drugs, Samson fell into a deep, deep sleep, and when he awoke and opened his eyes and saw only darkness, his first thought was that he was buried alive again. He reached out his arms to begin scratching away at the dirt, but there was no dirt. He felt nothing. He stood up, and his head hurt. He rubbed it and felt the stubble. He closed and opened his eyes. Carefully, he started to walk. He heard a giggle and swung out his arms. Then he felt the tip of his nose burned by fire. The giggle got louder. The fire was held to his lips and then to his fingers. In the darkness, he could feel the fire burning his skin. He just could not see it. He reached his hands up to his eyes, but his eyes were not there. The giggles turned into screams of laughter. When the impossible idea of his blindness finally sank in, Samson screeched like an eagle. Samson was only blind for a few weeks before he forgot what the world looked like. He could no longer even recall what faces were. Sometimes he thought he heard laughter. Sometimes he thought he felt the tip of a finger on his back. He would flip around and slice his arms through the darkness, touching nothing. Often he would think his father was nearby in the darkness, and he would try to keep himself from crying. But it was no use. Even when he was a kid, Samson hated being alone. Now, in the dark, he was terrified that he would be alone forever. In the darkness of his prison cell, he believed he was visited by God. "You have spent your life making an ass of yourself," said the Lord, "but you have done so in a most interesting way." God kissed Samson on the forehead and threw him into the air, where Samson flapped around and turned into a light that was pure and blinding. The brightness of the light that he was made his teeth hurt. He could not turn himself off, but he was free. He had finally become the angel he always knew he could be. When 2 guards showed up and dragged Samson out the door by his feet and into the sun, he thought he was being flown to heaven by angels. The guards brought him to the king's court, where a party was in full swing. They dragged him before the king, where they bound his arms to pillars. "I see it starting to grow back," said the king. "Your short hair makes your face look fat." Samson thought he was standing at the gates of heaven, and that the king was God. That God would be so cruel made sense to him. He tried to kneel, but his bound arms kept him upright. Standing there, Samson no longer wanted to think upon his old life. Now, he only wanted to get into heaven. Again he pulled at the pillars, trying to force his knees onto the ground, to supplicate himself, but his attempts were in vain. Then he heard the sound of lip smacking. The sound came from nearby, but Samson could not match the sound to any particular thing. It sounded like the universe was being sucked up. It sounded like the gates of heaven were being sealed. The sound came from Delilah's lips, which were kissing the chest of her lover. "I have always hated you," she spoke, her mouth full of grapes. Delilah then punched Samson directly on the belly button. "That is for everything," she said. Samson's eye sockets became wide, and you could see right into the blackness in his head. He lunged his chest forth, and the pillars shook. They began to give, imperceptibly at first, but then, with each tug, more and more. He felt the ground beneath his feet tremble. Then he heard cracking sounds, and the laughing turned to shrieking. Samson continued to thrust himself forward, longing to feel Delilah's touch once more.